Well, hello from Cali in Colombia, where we're here for the UN Biodiversity COP16, a hugely important meeting. And Rob Stoneman and myself delighted to be here to represent the wildlife trusts at this meeting. I got in late last night after flying down from the UK and woken up this morning to our little apartment, our little Airbnb in the centre of Cali, which is sort of Wildlife Trust Central for the time that we are here, and delighted that over the next couple of weeks we're going to be bringing you these daily broadcasts to let you know everything that's happening at COP16 and crucially what it means for nature and restoring nature in the UK and what it means for the government and all partners in the UK and how we deliver on it. In my career, a big frustration of mine has always been that sometimes even within NGOs we talk about the international context and the national context as if they're separate, but really these big global agreements, things like the climate talks, things like the nature talks, actually what really matters with all of them is what it means for delivering back at home, back in the UK, to make them real. And that's what we really want to shine a spotlight on as the wildlife trusts over these next couple of weeks. Now, I said I got in late last night and it is just 11 o'clock in the morning here in Cali, so I can't claim that I'm fully on top of all the details yet, but luckily my colleague Kathryn, Director of Climate Evidence at the Wildlife Trust, is back in the UK, and she's been following the details of the negotiations remotely and has been able to do that really well. So Kathryn, tell us, good to see you. Hello, Kathryn, and tell us what has been happening in the negotiations so far. What's happened on the first full day of negotiations on Monday?
Yeah, hi, Craig and Rob. So for those of you listening in, you can actually watch a lot of the negotiations online from the UK. So there is a COP16 virtual platform, which means that I can dial into all of the different meetings that are happening to keep up to date. And I counted today, there are 94 separate meetings going on at the conference. So that gives you a sense really of how busy the conference is. I know Rob and Sarah, who was chatting yesterday in our first update, was saying there's about 15,000 people at the conference. So you can imagine, you know, there are nearly 100 separate meetings and negotiations going on that different people are attending. So it's quite a busy space around the conference centre. And what we would normally see at the beginning of these COP conferences is it's quite procedural. So if you go into the plenary, which is the big negotiating space, usually it's looking at the adoption of the agenda. So that has to be done in a very formalized way before people, and particularly national delegates, can be sent off into their different negotiating groups. That all has to be agreed and sort of rubber stamped, if you like, before those negotiations can begin. And before COP started, actually, we were lucky enough to meet the COP president, Susanna Mohammed. She was over in the UK for a few days a few weeks ago. And we talked to her about her priorities around these negotiations. So just to give you a sense of the different topics, obviously there is the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which we heard a little bit about yesterday. That's the top of pretty much everybody's sets of priorities, and linked to that is these national biodiversity strategies and action plans, the NBSAPs. But we're also expecting to see a really big push on finance. So there was a financial deal struck at the last COP, at COP15, but as is always the case with these things, or pretty much always the case, we haven't seen those financial commitments coming through yet. So that's going to be a big topic of conversation. We know that sharing genetic resources is a really big one for the negotiations as well. And actually the UK has been playing a leading role in trying to convene some of those discussions. So that will be a really interesting one to see. And there's a big focus for the presidency in particular on communities and on data and monitoring. So what will happen over the next few days around all of these separate meetings that are happening is that those issues will start to be negotiated. And once parties have come to some kind of agreement, they will come back to the main plenary to be decided. And that's what we're going to be watching to see what happens and how ambitious those discussions are over the next few days. Those will happen in something called the Blue Zone, which is the negotiating space. And I know Rob and Craig have both been around the negotiations today to see what's going on. And Rob, you were going to talk a little bit about some of the events and the meetings that you saw yesterday on the first day of the negotiations.
Kathryn, I mean, the Blue Zone is quite interesting. It's it's where the negotiations are being held. And I did pop into the main negotiating hall, which is massive, about 1,000 people in there. And It was not the most scintillating discussion, I have to say. They were really into very much the procedural stuff, so that was fine. But around the negotiating hall are loads and loads of tents, actually. They're kind of tents set up with air conditioning. It's pretty hot here in Cali. And I went to a few of those so-called side events, particularly looking at the metrics of the negotiation. So how do countries actually know that they're making a difference? And so there was lots of discussions. I went to a meeting organised by the United Nations Environment Programme, World Monitoring Environmental Conservation Centre, and Nature Positive. And that was very interesting. But actually, the one we want to talk and focus on today was something that I went to that Wetlands International had organised, which was looking at, have wetlands been included in the NB SAPs? And that's a bit of a COP terminology. And I'll just hand over to Craig. What is an NB SAP, Craig?
Yeah, it's mad, isn't it? We don't have enough acronyms in the conservation world, so people thought we'd invent a few more. And clearly, what's happening? So NBSAP stands for National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans, and they're basically the plans that each country is supposed to put together to say how they intend to deliver on the targets that were set out in the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed at the Montreal meeting just 2 years ago. And obviously each country needs to submit them. They're kind of the equivalent to what we have in the UK of the requirement on the UK government to, or at least for England, to publish the Environmental Improvement Plan. And I've made this point to government in the past before now, because government is often very siloed between domestic agenda and international agenda as well. Really, the substance of these things should be the same. They are fundamentally, they're about what's the plan a country has to deliver on these targets. And you might have heard, I've made this point, I made it on BBC Farming Today just last Saturday, which is that imagine if as the UK, we were hosting something like the Olympics in 2030. You would have really clear project plans, Gantt charts and all those things to talk about how we're going to build all the venues in time to make sure that we open in time. And actually, by the way, you'd also have the real political commitment to lean in if anything fell behind schedule to solve it. It would just be too embarrassing to come to the opening ceremony of an Olympics or something like that in 2030 and for us not to have the venues built in time. And the job we have to do now is no different. It's about rebuilding our natural infrastructure by 2030. And for that, we need really clear project plans of how we're going to do it. What do we need to do in 2025 to enable us to do the next step in 26, the next step in 27, and so on, until we're able to say that we've restored natural infrastructure by 2030. And so every country around the world is supposed to be submitting these plans. Sadly, only a tiny handful of them have so far, and the UK has not yet submitted one. But we're hoping that might be because that when they come to do it, they submit a really good one, because the previous environmental improvement plan under the previous government was not good enough in our view. So we're hoping that they produce a much better environmental improvement plan, and that also gives them the substance to producing a really good National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan as well, which is submitted to the COP process. So that's what goes on. But Rob, you were talking about the importance of wetlands for all of this, and right through the Global Biodiversity Framework, there's so many targets that relate to wetlands, targets around cutting nutrient pollution, restoring 30% of our inland waters. I mean, people often talk about 30-30 being 30% of land and sea. That's true, but actually it's also supposed to be 30% of our inland waters that we put in recovery for nature by 2030. So, Rob, in your discussion, some of the events you went to yesterday, what do you think of when you translate that, the Global Biodiversity Framework, what it means for the UK? What's your sense about the real priorities there around our wetlands?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, it's interesting because, we're sitting here in Colombia, which is by many metrics, one of the most biodiverse and countries in the world, so it's got incredible. I mean, even from my apartment window here, I'm seeing, hundreds of species of birds. It's incredible, so really good biodiversity. And we're coming from a country with the most depleted nature in the world, which is pretty sad for us. But, we've still got some fantastic wildlife in the UK. And for example, we have 90% of the world's chalk streams. So our chalk streams are literally internationally important. We have blanket bogs and our peatland systems. which are pretty unique, you know, where they're found in very few parts of the world. So that's absolutely fantastic. And we have these fantastic lake ecosystems, and our lake ecosystems are really interesting because they go from very eutrophic lakes, the sort of things you might find in say East Anglia or something like that, to these very oligotrophic, i.e. very acid, nutrient poor lakes that you did used to find in the Lake District. But we've got many issues affecting our freshwaters and our wetlands. Kathryn, I mean, just tell us about some of the things that are impacting our, you know, freshwaters and wetlands.
Yeah, I mean, it's sadly, a whole medley actually of different pressures, and this is exactly what the Global Biodiversity Framework is trying to address through all of these targets it has, these 23 targets. And some of the issues we're looking at for our freshwater habitats and our wetlands from climate change include things like reductions in river flows. So the national projections for these that go into the UK's climate change risk assessment suggest really severe reductions in river flows, in rivers actually across the country, not just in the places you might expect in the south and the east of England. By the 2050s, we're seeing reductions in flows of, you know, in the order of 30 to 50%. And this is during times of low flows already. So this is when it's dry, how much worse it's going to be for those habitats. And even for the Wildlife Trust, we've done our own assessment of those hazards for our reserves. So we have over 2,600 nature reserves across the UK. And we're seeing over half of those will probably see reductions in flows of more than 30% by 2050. So that's a really big drop, a really big risk. And alongside that risk, you get rising water temperatures, obviously, particularly during heat waves events, which are really damaging for lots of different species. We've seen actually some really disturbing trends in things like salmon numbers in rivers in the UK. In recent weeks, we've seen the lowest ever recorded numbers of salmon, and salmon is a species that's particularly vulnerable to higher water temperatures. And the problem you get is the effects of climate change are compounding these other effects we see from pollution, from exploitation and from drainage of wetlands as well. So all these things are kind of coming together. And we can see this happening already. So in areas like the River Wye, we're seeing the effects of pollution, mainly from agricultural runoff. There's quite a bit of evidence for that being concentrated during times of low flows. We're seeing heavy pollution in Windermere. That's been in the media quite a lot this year as well. And of course, we're seeing degradation of our peatlands, and our peatlands across the UK are in really poor condition. So around 80% of peatlands are still in quite poor condition. And again, you know, organisations like all of our local wildlife trusts with other NGOs, we're a big player actually in peatland restoration across the UK. So we're restoring around 60,000 hectares of peatlands at the moment across the UK. But we need to see that cessation of burning, of drainage of peatlands, and actually people stopping buying peat compost as well. And that's something that we've been trying to see for a really long time. And we've still seen sort of stalling by the government to try and bring in this ban on the use of peat in horticulture. So that's something I know that our teams here at the Wildlife Trust working on peat are really keen to see come forward. And we're starting to see some progress. We're starting to see better labelling, better consumer choices happening around those as well. But all these things together, particularly when you bring in the effects of climate change, are really an area where we will see these compounding effects. And actually a lot of these risks, when we think about the prediction of future risks, it's only based on average changes. So actually the effects that we could see for our freshwater habitats and our wetlands could be quite a bit worse even than the projections are showing us. So it's a big problem. You know, it's one that we want to see the negotiations starting to tackle. And obviously, as we've been saying, we want to see the UK government taking domestic action to alleviate these pressures and try and take a much more systemic approach to managing these habitats as well. And Craig, I know you wanted to give a few examples of some of the work that we're already seeing, but we'd like to see more of.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, just before Craig comes in, I mean, I think you're really exposing the you know, what this process is all about. So internationally, we've agreed these targets at an international level. And actually, if we just take wetlands as one of our, you know, critically important habitat types, because we've got these fantastic wetlands in the UK, actually, they're already in trouble, pollution, burning, all that sort of stuff. And it's going to get worse because of climate change. So actually, this is why these negotiations are so important for our domestic agenda. Craig, tell us, you know, what sort of things would we want the government and indeed, you know, wider society to do to make a difference for wetlands?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give that list. But, before I do that, I should just recognize we had some great questions coming in live, which has been fantastic. I know one came in from Ellie asking whether reductions in river flow affects the animals living in them, for example, otters and so on. The answer is absolutely, Ellie, yes, it does, 100%. And, actually a good, healthy, free-flowing river is one that has good flow in it, good discharge, which is why it's really important for us to make sure that when we're building new homes, new buildings, they are to the highest possible water efficiency standards. Why it's really important to ensure water companies are hammering down on leakage, for example. Why it's really important just to make sure we're not wasting water across society more generally, because every time we do that, we're taking water out of wetlands, and that is habitat for these species. But I mean, Rob was just asking the question, what do we need? I was talking before about how we absolutely need the government to get on, produce a really good environmental improvement plan, and also to submit that a really strong NBSAP, so the planning process for the UN talks as well. And we hope that will happen soon. But let's bring it down to reality. There's some other things. I mean, allowing the free roaming beavers in Britain. This has been going on for too long now. It's ludicrous. We cannot deliver the global biodiversity framework if in England we've even got a problem about reintroducing a species like beavers, which is such an important ecosystem engineer that creates new wetlands for free, that cleans up our rivers, creates new habitat for fish and insects and plenty of other species. Let's just move fast. Wouldn't it be lovely if during COP16, the new government decided this was a good time to announce they're going to allow free roaming beavers in Britain with proper licensing and all those things, of course. But, at the Wildlife Trust, we're beaver ready. We've got beavers enclosures across the country. We just want to get on and see them out there in the wild. Obviously, hammering down on nutrient pollution. We have signed up as a country through the Global Biodiversity Framework to halve nutrient pollution, which is things like poo in our rivers, agricultural runoff and so on, halving that by 2030. And there's been this silly little debate in Britain, particularly from the house builders, who say they can't even deliver nutrient neutrality. Well, nutrient neutrality is just stopping the issue but getting worse. What we've signed up to a country, what we've committed to is halving nutrient pollution, not just making sure it doesn't get any worse. So we've got to get real. We've got to have serious plans about how we hammer down nutrient pollution, which again means stopping the scandal of sewage going into our rivers, but also really having a plan to massively cut agricultural runoff, in other words, poo from animals, into our rivers as well. And we haven't seen nearly enough thinking on that at the moment as well. We need to enforce current laws. You wouldn't think it's too much to ask, but there's a lot of our laws at the moment, particularly around pollution, are not being properly enforced, and we need to make sure we properly resource and give the political support to agencies like the Environment Agency to be doing that. We need to build much greater access to blue space. So Labour Party, for example, in their general election manifesto did commit to several new river walks, national river walks across the country, which I think was a great idea. We would say as the Wildlife Trust that the best way to deliver that is to start to create wild belt along our rivers in Britain, so that we're not just creating paths, but we're creating big vegetation buffers along our rivers. And that one piece of policy could massively reduce agricultural runoff into our rivers, reduce soil erosion, create a nature recovery network alongside our rivers. They become the bone, the foundations really of that nature recovery network, help our rivers adapt to climate change by producing more shading and so on. And of course, if you put paths through them and bike paths and so on, help for recreation and enable people to connect to our blue space, crucially important. We should absolutely be banning moorland burning. We have this scandal of moorland still being burnt. And when that happens, of course, that means you get huge amounts of flash runoff and loss of soil and loss of peatlands straight into our rivers. It's funny, isn't it? When it's on the land, we call it soil. When we call it in the river, we call it sediment, and think about it differently, but actually it's the same thing. And of course, that's what causes a lot of flooding as well. And we need to really be thinking about how we restore that blue urban infrastructure as well. How can we actually put our rivers back in our towns and cities? There's been some amazing projects around the world, whether you're talking Seoul in South Korea, whether you're talking in parts of the Netherlands, where actually rivers have been brought back into our towns and cities, have been taken out of their concrete culverts. Staffordshire Wildlife Trust has done a brilliant project in the middle of Stoke-on-Trent, where they've renaturalised the River Trent right in the centre of Stoke, connecting that river and its beautiful space to the local community as well. So doing that, seeing how we can make space for rivers at the same time as also connecting people and wildlife habitats around the rivers as well. Hugely important.
Just want to pick up a question from Brian. Thank you. Don't beavers reduce flow? I mean, they do a couple of things. So when beavers create dams and create little wetlands in the upper reaches of the rivers, in the lower reaches, they tend not to dam across the river, they're too big. But in the upper reaches, create dams. So what that does is it slows the flow through the whole system, which is great for flood defense. That's really important for us. That's really useful. But in between the dams, it actually increases the rate of flow. So what you get is you get a much more natural river system. So you have areas of pools, beaver pools and things like that, and then faster flowing streams between the pools. That's really important, especially for some of our fish species that rely on that clean sediments. They need a good flow through there. So bringing beavers back is good for all of the wildlife on our rivers, also good for us.
So there you are. We've taken you through a wonderful journey today about, what's happening here at COP16 in Cali in Colombia, around the Global Biodiversity Framework, and particularly what it's saying around our freshwater systems and what it means for us in the UK. You would have seen there's been great chat questions coming in. Thank you very much. And you would have seen that my colleagues have also been putting links in the chat to lots of documents that provide further information about the things we've been talking about, for example, our amazing beaver vision that we have with the Wildlife Trust. What would it look like to have beavers properly back in our landscape, around those MBSAP reports and so on, and also links to work by the brilliant coalition Blueprint for Water, which is a coalition of lots of NGOs in the UK working to try and make sure that we improve the state of our rivers and wetlands in the UK. And finally, don't forget also to go to our website, and my colleagues will put in a link here as well, I'm sure, to sign up for our daily notifications from COP16. We want to make sure that you've got a real insight to what's going on here in the COP16 conference in Cali in Colombia. And if you sign up for those daily notifications, you'll get them into your email box every day, telling you what's going on, and also make sure that you join every day for these daily video updates from Cali in Colombia. I think that's about it for today, but we're going to head out there now. It's just coming up to 11:30 in Colombia. We're going to be heading out there, meeting loads more people, joining loads more meetings today, finding lots more, and we will report back to you tomorrow from Cali in Colombia. Thank you and goodbye.